Good morning. How has the start of your 2018 been? Okay, blessed. I know a lot of people are sick. I look around at the pews. I've heard a lot of people out the past week or so with pretty severe colds. They've called it. The officials have announced that it's actually a flu epidemic now. A lot of people are coming down with pretty nasty bugs. So I'm glad that you're here, and I hope most of you are healthy for the most part. Today we are beginning a new series as start of this new year focused on grace. There are a lot of new things around this church so far. You've maybe seen the new banner out in the lobby. You've seen the new bulletin. Several of you have said, "Oh, it's confusing. What's going on?" But hopefully, it's not too confusing. You figure things out. And we're going to be doing something a little different in the worship service as well. At the end of the service, or towards the end of the service, you see in the bulletin there's going to be time for reflection. And it'll look a little different from week to week, but the point of this time is going to be to actually respond to the message and the things that we've gone through the worship service. So today, what's going to happen at the end, and we'll remind you at the end, is when it comes time for that, we're going to have time for you to get into a group of 3 or 4. I know for us introverts, it's not going to be a huge group, so just a couple of people, 3 or 4, and go over a couple of discussion questions. So a little, I know it's new, something different, but I believe it's going to be a blessing as we focus this year on grace. Today, we are starting our new series titled Stories of Grace, and this is going to be a little bit of a different sermon series as well, because every week we're just going to be spending time looking at one modern story. It's not going to be a lot of scripture, it's not going to be a lot of quotations, it's not going to be a lot of in-depth theology. That will come later in the year, don't worry. But right now, we're building on the foundation that we looked at last week, the cross, which is the foundation of grace. Now we're going to be telling some stories of grace that help the framework as we continue to add and learn and grow in our understanding of this powerful truth and concept of grace. To help set the stage for this morning's story, there's a quote from J.I. Packer, a well-known Christian theologian and author. And he says, "To be right with God, the judge, is a great thing, but to be loved and cared for by God the Father is greater." Stephanie Fast got off the train and waited for her uncle to pick her up. This was shortly after the end of the Korean War. And Stephanie's mother had packed up a lunch for her, set her on the train to go live with her uncle, a distant uncle on the other side of the country. See, Stephanie was the product of a short time spent between an American GI and a young South Korean woman. And the fact that her mother had given birth to a child outside of marriage was almost like social suicide back then. But it was compounded, and it was made infinitely worse by the fact that she had actually given birth to a biracial child. No one would ever want to marry Stephanie's mother now. So after much heartbreak and pleading and tears, her mother sent her away to live with this distant uncle because she had found a man that would marry her on the one condition that Stephanie was completely and totally removed from the picture. Stephanie got off the train and waited for her uncle and waited and waited and waited until the last trains came and went. The train master came to close the station, and he saw this young girl, about 4 years old, all alone on the platform, and he went to see what the problem was. As he got closer to Stephanie, though, he saw that she was biracial, and his countenance totally changed. he began to yell at her and scream at her, and he chased her out of the train station, saying that she was nothing but a no-good tugi. Tugi in Korean literally means half-blood or half-breed, but it also has the connotation of trash, garbage, dirt. It has the same visceral punch that the N-word has in our country today. Stephanie didn't know what to do. She found a cart that was filled with straw, and she spent the night there and the next night waiting for her uncle. But no one ever came to claim Stephanie. And so began her odyssey, difficult, painful odyssey. She soon found herself out in the countryside with a few other children who had been made homeless in the wake of the Korean War. She was a quick study, and she learned how to provide for herself, at least food. She would steal from the farmers. She stole from their fruit crops and their vegetable crops and their rice crops. But also she would catch locusts. She would catch a bunch of locusts, and she would take a straw and poke them through their heads, and then put them on a string and tie the string around her belt. And by the end of the day, the locusts were all dried out, and she would eat them for supper. Other times, she would find a hole in the ground where the field mice would pop out of, and she would wait quietly and patiently and snatch them before they could scurry back. She would then cook them and eat them almost whole. All things considered, Stephanie was doing okay providing for herself until winter came. Stephanie should have died that first winter because all she had for shelter was a literal foxhole that she had filled with straw that she had managed to scavenge. On the colder nights, she would sneak down to the village where some of the older ladies would sometimes leave the door to their kitchen unlocked so that Stephanie and other children like her could come in, spend the night on the dirt floor, and get some heat by the stove. But that was about the only kindness that Stephanie received, because she received an infinite more amount of abuse. The other children, the other homeless children that she would come across would just mock her and make fun of her constantly, because while they were homeless, they were full-blooded Korean. And so they would call her Tugi over and over again. She also received verbal abuse at the hands of the farmers that would see her stealing from their crops from a distance, and they would shout and yell abuse and call her Tugi. And these words began to have an impact on little Stephanie. She says, "To everyone, I was a dirty Tugi. And when you're a little child and hear people call you that day after day, you begin to believe it about yourself. I believed I wasn't a person. I was worthless. I was dirty. I was unclean. I had no name. I had no identity. I had no family. I had no future and no hope. Over time, I began to hate myself." And this verbal abuse wasn't the only type of abuse that Stephanie suffered. One day, some farmers caught her stealing some of their crops. So they took her and they threw her into an abandoned well. Stephanie began to panic because she didn't know how to swim, but she saw that there was a rock popping out from the wall, and she climbed on it and was able to sit. And as she sat in this abandoned well, she began to think that she was going to die. She thought to herself, "I know that people don't like me, but what have I done that is so wrong? What is so bad about me that they actually want to kill me? Why can't I have a normal childhood with a mommy and daddy that love me?" And as she sat there thinking about these things, thinking about dying, at dusk she heard an old lady's voice. This old little called out, little girl, are you still there? Are you still there in the well?" And Stephanie cried out, "Yes, I'm here. And this old lady lowered down a bucket for Stephanie, and she climbed into it, and the old lady pulled her up. She set her down on the ground and covered her with straw so that she could warm up, gave her some fresh food. And she told her, there are people here that want to hurt you, that might kill you, but you can't let this happen. You have to live. A little while later, Stephanie again was caught by some other farmers as she tried to steal their food. One of the farmers said, we have to get rid of her. She's nothing but a pest and a nuisance. So the other farmers took her and they tied her to a water wheel over the main irrigation channel. And so Stephanie felt her limbs being stretched out on this wheel, and then down she went into the water, her face being pelted by these pebbles flowing through the stream, her mouth and nose filling with water and sand, and she felt again that she was going to die. But then she popped out of the water with time enough to cough out all of the sand and gasp for air and scream for help just before she went back into the water again to be pelted by more rocks and debris that was floating. Again, she popped out of the water enough to clear her lungs, to breathe and to cry. And again, she went into the water, cycle after cycle, and it continued to be painful, and she continued to be hit by debris in the water until her face was bloodied and her eyes were swollen almost shut. Again, she thought this was it. She was going to die. She popped out of the water, and then it stopped, the wheel. And she heard another voice. This time it was the voice of an old man. And he said, it's okay. I'm going to help you. I'm going to take you off this wheel. Please don't fight me, little girl. And he set her down on dry land. She couldn't really see what he looked like at all because of her swollen eyes. But he said to her almost the same thing that the old woman had told her previously. He said, little girl, there are people here that will hurt you, that will want to kill you, but you can't let this happen. You must live. And so Stephanie made her way to Daejeon, one of the largest cities in South Korea. When she got into the city, she was met by this young teenage boy who looked at her and called her a tugi, but then said, do you have a place to stay? No one had ever offered Stephanie a place to stay before, so she went with this teenage boy, and he took her to the riverbank where she was amazed to see 200 children living there in a children's village, all homeless children, displaced children. This young teenage boy introduced Stephanie to the rest of his gang, which are children about Stephanie's age, a little older, some a little bit older than them. And they said, welcome to our gang, Stephanie. You are now part of our family. And Stephanie had never been part of a family before, and so she was thrilled, and things started off so well. They shared their food with her. They shared their blankets with her. They built big bonfires and told stories and folk tales. But after a few days, the sexual abuse started. Even though Stephanie was only 7 years old, she knew that it was wrong. But since she had never been part of a family before, she thought, well, maybe this is just what families do. And so she stayed for quite some time until the cholera epidemic swept through South Korea. Stephanie came down with cholera and she lost a tremendous amount of weight, even though she didn't have much weight to lose. She came down with a high fever and began to hallucinate. But the one clear thought she had was that she needed to get back to the countryside because there the air was cleaner and there she could recover and feel better. And so she said, I've got to go. So she started to try to go to the countryside, but she was hungry, and so she needed some food, and she saw this farm, and she went to grab some food, and she was caught again by some farmers. The farmers took her to an abandoned building that had been bombed out during the war. The only life in this building was an infestation of vicious and dangerous gutter rats. In fact, it was so infested with these rats that the homeless children would never go in this building. And yet this is where the farmers threw Stephanie into to die. This was Stephanie's last thought before she lost consciousness. When she regained consciousness, there was something different. The first thing she noticed was there's this pair of brilliant blue eyes hovering over her. These eyes belonged to a woman named Iris Eriksson, who was a World Vision nurse from Sweden. She had come to South Korea to work for a clinic whose mission it was to try to save as many of the street babies as possible, because at this time, Korea was still devastated. Their supplies were still devastated in the wake and the aftermath of the war. And so many Korean families had babies that they simply didn't have enough food for. And so they would set these babies out and abandon them on the street. Iris, part of her job was to search for these babies and bring them back to her clinic. And as she was out one day looking for these babies, she passed by this pile of trash. And mixed in with the other garbage was Stephanie, who at that time was more dead than alive. Iris saw Stephanie there in the garbage heap, but she knew what her mandate was, and it was to save the babies, because they had a much higher chance of survival than older kids did. And so even though it broke her heart, Iris started to walk away and left Stephanie on the trash pile until she heard a voice. As Iris was leaving, she heard this voice talk to her in Swedish, and it said, "She is mine." Iris looked around, and she was the only one there, much less the only one that could speak Swedish. She knew it was God's voice. So she turned around and she picked Stephanie up off the trash heap. She took her back to her clinic and nursed her back to health over the course of 2 weeks. At the end of 2 weeks, Stephanie was better, not completely better, but well enough to be transferred to World Vision's orphanage there in the heart of the city. When she got to the orphanage, even though it was fairly primitive in terms of its living standards, Stephanie began to enjoy life for the first time. Surrounded by all of these babies, she was the oldest child there at the orphanage, and so she would help give care to the babies. She would help clean them and change their diapers and wash their diapers and carry them around on her back as she worked and hug them and sing to them. Every once in a while, one of the babies would disappear. And she was told, though, that they had been sent to America because they had been adopted. She didn't quite understand what any of that meant, but it seemed to be a good thing. And so she was happy for these babies when they would disappear occasionally. Then one day, the director of the orphanage made an announcement that there was an American couple, an American missionary couple that was going to come to the orphanage to pick out a baby boy to adopt. And so Stephanie got excited and went to work cleaning up all the baby boys, washing them, combing their hair, changing their diapers, pinching their cheeks, making sure they were in the best condition possible. And that afternoon when the doorbell rung, Stephanie watched as this massive man walked through the door. She had never seen anyone as tall or as big as this man before. She thought he was a giant. At that time, the only people in Korea that had any extra meat on their bones were the very rich. And by looking at this man, she thought he was the most wealthy man on the planet. And then when his wife walked in, she saw that she was nearly as tall as he was. And she just stood in amazement as this mountain of a man walked over to the first baby boy's bassinet, gently pick up the baby boy, nuzzle him to his chest, hug him, kiss him, placed him back down. This giant man walked over to the next bassinet and did the same thing with baby boy number 2 and hugged him and kissed him and placed him back down. And he walked over to bassinet number 3, and as he did, he saw Stephanie out of the corner of his eye. Stephanie had been so curious that she had been tiptoeing forward just to get a better look at this man. And after he had nuzzled baby number 3, hugged him and kissed him and placed him back down, he walked over to Stephanie, who instinctively backpedaled a few steps. Then this giant man knelt down, looked at Stephanie in the eye, and raised his massive hand over her head and began to lovingly stroke her face. There was nothing about Stephanie's appearance that was winsome or attractive or should have caught the attention of this man. At this point, Stephanie, due to her years of homelessness, even though she had bathed, she had dirt that was almost permanently ingrained in her skin, especially in her elbows and in her knees. She had lice so bad that her head was basically white. She had intestinal worms that were so bad that when the worms got hungry, they would crawl out of her throat and out of her mouth. She had a lazy eye that would just flop every which way, and her vision was just poor in general due to malnutrition. See, at age 9, Stephanie was so malnourished that she weighed less than 30 pounds. And to top it off, she was covered from head to toe in boils and scabs and scars. There was nothing about her that should have gotten the attention of this man. And yet there he was, kneeling in front of her, caressing her face in love. Inside of her, Stephanie was telling herself, this is amazing. This feels so good. Don't ever let this man put his hand down. But because this was the first time that anyone had ever reached out to Stephanie in love, she didn't know how to respond appropriately. So she yanked the man's hand down and she spit on him twice and then ran away and hid in a closet. Here was Stephanie's chance for love and for happiness, for grace. And she rejected it in one of the most vile ways imaginable. But grace did not stop pursuing Stephanie. The next day, the director of the orphanage called Stephanie into his office. And she thought, well, this is it. I'm going to be in big trouble for what I did yesterday. They're going to beat me. They might kick me out. But when she walked into the office, she was stunned to see Mr. and Mrs. Giant there. The interpreter told her that this couple, Mr. and Mrs. Merwin, wanted to take Stephanie home with them. She still didn't understand this concept of adoption. She didn't know what it meant. The only thing that she could make sense of was that they wanted to bring her home with them so that she could be their servant. And she was okay with this. She was excited about this because she could think, yes, I can work hard and I can repay the room and board they'll give me. I can work hard and repay their kindness and their generosity. I can work hard and I can be their servant. I'm going to be the best servant I can be. That's the only thing she could think of. And so, when the Merwins took her home, to a home that was fairly modest by American standards, but seemed to be a palace of luxury to Stephanie because it was filled with things she had never seen before, a flush toilet and a refrigerator and a bed with a mattress on it. She was amazed. She said, I'm going to have a great time. It's going to be fun working here. But the Merwins didn't put her to work. They just fed her, gave her medicine, bought her new clothes. tucked her into bed at night. And this went on for months. Stephanie was too afraid to say anything about it. The Merwins would continue to take Stephanie with them when they went to town. And she started to notice that people were treating her differently. They weren't looking at her weird. They weren't yelling at her. They weren't calling her Toogie. Instead, they were treating her like a princess. One of these times in town, she was talking to another young girl, and this young girl said to her, "Stephanie, you smell weird. You smell like an American." She said, what do you mean? What are you talking about? And the other girl said, "Yeah, Stephanie, you smell like cheese." At that time, all the Korean children thought foreigners just smelled like cheese. Stephanie said, "I don't smell like cheese, but you're right. These Americans are weird because they haven't put me to work yet. They brought me home as their servant, but they haven't given me any jobs or anything." This other girl looked at Stephanie with a confused look on her face and said, "Stephanie, no, you're not their servant, you're their daughter." This was the first time that this concept had entered into Stephanie's mind, and she couldn't wrap her head around it. And she said, "No, I'm not their daughter, I'm their servant." The other girl said, "No, don't you see? Don't you see what they've done for you? Don't you see what they do for you? Don't you see how they care for you? Don't you see how they love you? You're not their servant, you are their daughter." And it clicked in that moment for Stephanie. She says, "I was astonished. I turned and ran out of the room and up the hill toward my house, thinking to myself, I'm their daughter. I'm their daughter. I'm their daughter. Oh, that's why I've been treated this way. That's why no one's beating me. That's why nobody's calling me a Toogie. I'm their daughter." And she ran into the house and she went looking for her mother and she ran into the room where her mother was in and she called out in Korean, "I'm your daughter." Her mother didn't speak Korean yet, and so one of the other workers translated what Stephanie had said. And so her mother looked at Stephanie with tears rolling down her cheeks and said, "Yes, Stephanie. Yes, you are my daughter." This is grace. But the story of grace doesn't end there. Because the Merwins, as a missionary family, even though Stephanie had been adopted into a missionary family who, after a few years, went back to the United States, and her father continued work as a pastor, she had heard a lot about Jesus. She learned a lot about Jesus. She knew a lot about Jesus, but she didn't understand, it didn't connect with her the love of Jesus. Until one night when she was 16 years old. She was going through some typical teenager emotional things, along with just having to wrestle with the baggage from her childhood. And so her father went into her room, as he had done several times before, and he told her about the love of Jesus again. He said, "Stephanie, Jesus knows everything that you've gone through, and he loves you in spite of it all, and he will always love you." And that night, God's grace finally clicked for Stephanie. Before then, she says, when I would hear about God's love, I always felt it as love for everyone else. He couldn't love me, right? I was a mistake. He couldn't love me. I was born out of sin. He couldn't love me. I'm biracial. He can't love me. I was raped. He can't love me. I was abused. He can't love me. I have this awful anger inside. But that night came the realization, He loves me. This, friends, is the story of grace. This story is your story, and this story is my story. We might not have had the same experiences that Stephanie had, but we share the story of grace in common, because there is no reason why you and I should have found favor in the eyes of God. We are products of this sinful and broken world. We have sin that is so deeply ingrained into us that it's almost permanent in our knees and in our elbows. We have sin that has covered our head and sin that wants to escape out of our throats. We have sin that has messed up our vision and has left us covered in scabs and scars. And yet God reaches out His hand to you and to me with love, with compassion, with grace, with an invitation to become a part of His family. There is nothing about us that warrants the grace of God. There is nothing about us that has earned a place in God's family. There is nothing about you or there is nothing about me that entitles us to be a son or daughter of God Most High. And yet, because of His grace, He offers that invitation to each of us. J.I. Packer also writes that it's like a fairy story. The reigning monarch adopts waifs and strays to make princes of them. But praise God, it is not a fairy story. It is a hard and solid fact, founded on the bedrock of free and sovereign grace. This, and nothing less than this, is what adoption means. No wonder that John cries, "Behold, what manner of love." When you understand adoption, your heart will cry the same. 1 John 3:1 says, "Behold, what manner of love the Father has given to us, that you and I should be called the children of God." And that is what we are. You and I have the privilege, the opportunity to respond to the grace of God, to reach out to that hand that is reaching out to us in love and in compassion and in grace, and say, "Yes, I want to be adopted by you. Yes, I want to be a part of your family, God. Yes, I accept your grace." It doesn't matter if we've rejected God's grace before. It doesn't matter if we slapped away His hand. It doesn't matter if we've spit on Him once or twice or hundreds of times. God's grace still searches for you this morning. John says in chapter 1, verse 12, "But to all who did accept Him and believe Him, He gave the right to become children of God." All we have to do is accept God's grace. All we have to do is accept His grace. And that is the story of grace.